I never thought that buying a quiet suburban home would thrust me into a battle I didn't even see coming. When I walked up the driveway on moving day, I told myself, this is the fresh start I need. My two-bedroom ranch tucked into the corner of a well-groomed neighborhood, the kind of place where emails come with smiley faces and lawns are trimmed to perfection. The community was governed by the HOA, yes, those three letters that often signal peace of mind, but sometimes whisper trouble. Little did I know which scenario I was stepping into. As someone who uses a wheelchair, accessibility has always been at the forefront of my mind. When I signed the papers for this house, I asked about walkway slopes, curb cuts, ramp options, all standard questions for me. The realtor assured me, everything's fine. The HOA rules, the fine print, all fine. I moved in with hopes and a cautious optimism that everything meant what I needed it to mean. First weeks were smooth. I waved to neighbors trimming hedges, heard soft greetings across fences, and felt for a moment I'd found the peaceful place I craved. The driveway was a little steep when I wheeled down it, but manageable. The front porch had a two-step entry, but again, manageable. I'd lived with worse. I told myself this was a win. Then, the HOA mailed a notice. Please remove the temporary ramp at your front entry. It violates item 12 in the community guidelines. My heart sank. I had bought and installed a removable ramp precisely so I could come and go safely and independently. The notice said, temporary ramp, because it lacked their sign-off. Their reason? It interfered with the aesthetic and could not remain. I wrote back explaining, I'm disabled. I need that ramp for equal access, they replied. File a request, bring documentation, wait for board approval. So I did. I submitted my formal written request for an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act and relevant state fair housing laws. I included a letter from my physician outlining my mobility impairment and need for ramp access. I attached photos of my entryway, the ramp, and how without it I would face unsafe access into my home. I asked the HOA to authorize a permanent ramp that complies with their guidelines, but acknowledges my disability. Weeks went by. I heard nothing. In that silence, unease perched in my mind. Emails to board members were politely answered with generic, "We are reviewing your request," responses. I tried again. "Can someone confirm time frame?" Silence. Then one day I rolled out of my front door in full daylight and encountered a freshly placed violation. Remove ramp within 48 hours notice on the front door. My heart pounded. They had closed the loop without approval. It felt hostile. I attended the next HOA meeting, in person, with my wheelchair tucked beside the chair in front of the lectern. I asked for the board to address my case. The board president spoke. "We're still reviewing your request. As per rules, no structure may be placed in the communal easement." My voice didn't sound strong or angry in the memory. I felt small. I reminded them I lived there too, and accessible entry was not a luxury, but a necessity under law. They nodded politely and said they would consider it. I wheeled out feeling uneasy again. Then the ramp got sabotaged. One night I heard noise outside. I looked out the window. A board member's husband, I later confirmed, appeared to have unscrewed part of the ramp. The next morning, screws missing, bent aluminum, instability. I reported it, both to the board and to the police for possible vandalism. The board finally sent a strong-sounding letter. Cease all modifications and remove ramp immediately. No apology, no acknowledgement of my disability rights, just ultimatum. The tension raised. I felt isolated. Neighbors who once greeted me now looked away. The board had the veneer of respected authority, newsletters, community barbecues, tidy lawns, but beneath that veneer, a ticking urgency to enforce rules. Something had changed when I revealed my ramp. Perhaps I disturbed the status quo. Perhaps I became that homeowner. I began conducting research. Disability access laws, HOA obligations, precedent cases. The more I learned, the more I felt the board closing in on me, like they saw me as an unwelcome challenge to their uniform aesthetic. One evening at dusk, I rolled up to the mailbox area and found yet another letter. A fine of $250 per week, starting in 2 weeks unless I removed the ramp. I stared at the paper, fingers shaking. How could a board fine me for trying to get in and out of my home safely? I drafted an email. This fine is discriminatory as applied to me, given my documented disability. I hit send and waited. The reply came. We deny your request for accommodation. The ramp must go. No mention of discussion. No mention of alternate accessible route. Nothing. I felt the walls closing around me. I started telling a few trusted neighbors. One said quietly, "You know the HOA president's widow lives next door. She's always been picky about rules." Another, in hushed tones, revealed the broad control the board wields here. Rules about mailbox flag colors, hedge heights, even flags hanging from porches. This was not the collaborative community I thought I was joining. It was a micro-regime of aesthetics. I realized I was up against more than a regulation. I was up against a culture of enforcement. Night after night, I lay awake thinking, do I remove the ramp and sacrifice safety, or keep fighting? I began seeing how the board's communications always couched enforcement as community fairness, but I knew this was unequal treatment. I contacted a disability rights attorney who specializes in housing and common interest communities. We held a preliminary talk. Yes, the HOA must provide reasonable accommodation unless it causes undue burden. But it cannot just flat deny and fine you. My pulse quickened at the thought that this fight might escalate. Then came the day I heard the doorbell ring late afternoon. The board president was standing there. She looked me in the eye and said, "The board has reviewed your case. We will schedule a hearing." I believed for a split second that they finally understood. I wheeled inside. I took a calming breath, and the next morning I opened my mailbox to find a certified letter. HOA Board Decision. Denial of accommodation request. Fine begins in 7 days. That was the blow. No reasoning, no alternative offered, just denial. I looked at the fine notice and felt a surging anger and fear. If I pay the fine, I relinquish my safety. If I fight, I risk thousands. I realized I was backed into a corner. I composed my next move. I wrote to the attorney, "We should prepare demand letter under Fair Housing Act and ADA." I gathered evidence, emails, notices, the vandalized ramp, the certified denial. I took photos of myself struggling the moment I leave the rampless front entry, wheeling down the 2 steps with help and higher risk of tipping. Documentation was stacking up. Then, just as I felt things about to snap, I received a surprising email from the board. "We'd like to meet privately to discuss your access issues and reach a resolution." My heart raced. What changed? Had they received a leak that I was prepping legal action? Was the board getting nervous? Or were they attempting to maneuver before public exposure? I accepted the meeting date, tentatively, but decided to attend with my attorney present, virtually. I strapped in mentally. This was the moment of truth. But when I arrived at the clubhouse, I found only 2 board members, the president and her son. They said they had reviewed the cost estimates. They said they might approve a ramp, but only if I agreed to community-approved design with specific wood stain to match the porch, and paid for the installation myself. They also demanded I waive any claims against the HOA. I paused, heart pounding. This was no accommodation. This was a trap. They were trying to shift cost and risk to me while locking me into a waiver. I knew my attorney would call that a bad faith offer. I left the meeting feeling more threatened than hopeful. I wheeled back home underneath the shrinking orange sky, feeling isolated, angry, beaten. At that moment, I realized the HOA didn't see me as a member of the community. They saw me as a liability, something that challenged their uniform look, something that must either conform or be sidelined. And in their eyes, community meant everything looked the same. I decided enough was enough. The next morning, I drafted a demand letter to the HOA, referencing federal law, state fair housing statute, and local precedent. I attached documentation. I gave them a deadline. Respond within 10 days with a reasonable accommodation proposal, or else I would begin legal proceedings. I fired off the email and sat back, adrenaline coursing through me. Then I saw it. A board member truck parked in front of my house. The next day, a landscaper arrived and regraded the driveway without my consent, making the slope steeper. I wheeled down that driveway and felt my front wheels grind, the sweat at my temples. It dawned on me. They were retaliating. Retaliation for my accommodation request, and now for my legal posture. At that point, I realized, this isn't just about a ramp anymore. This is about recognition, equal access, power, and accountability. The fight had just begun. When I sent that legal demand letter, I expected fear or panic from the board. Instead, I got silence. A thick, deliberate silence. For a week, nothing happened. No emails, no letters, no notices taped to my door. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind that brings peace. It was the kind that creeps under your skin. Neighbors started whispering again. People who once waved now turned their heads. I could almost feel the HOA's presence even when I was alone, like a quiet, watching eye from behind those perfectly painted windows. Then, the retaliation began in subtle ways. One morning, the trash company forgot my pickup 3 weeks in a row. The service was arranged by the HOA. When I called, they said, "We were told your house was temporarily inactive." Another day, my mailbox lock was mysteriously jammed shut. The landscaping crew stopped trimming the grass near my walkway, leaving knee-high weeds crawling toward my porch. Every small inconvenience began to feel deliberate, coordinated. The final push came when I received a violation notice claiming my driveway slope modification was unauthorized. I stared at that letter for minutes, trying not to scream. They had regraded the driveway without permission. They had made it worse, and now they were fining me for it. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't just ignoring me anymore. They were trying to break me. I decided to document everything. Every missed service, every notice, every witness statement from neighbors who saw the board member's truck at my property. I stored timestamps, photos, and email threads in a folder titled HOA Case, Evidence. Each file felt like another brick in the wall I was building against them. I knew if this went to court, truth would be my only weapon. But as I built my case, the board built theirs too, at least in public. Suddenly, the neighborhood Facebook group was filled with subtle posts about homeowners abusing privileges and unapproved modifications damaging property values. They didn't name me, but everyone knew. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was social isolation, public shaming masked as community updates. I remember reading one comment, "Some people think rules don't apply to them just because they want special treatment." That line hit me hard. It wasn't about a ramp anymore. It was about perception. The HOA had managed to twist a basic disability accommodation into something selfish. A few days later, I saw the HOA president standing outside my house, snapping photos of the ramp again. She didn't look at me, just took pictures, typed something on her tablet, and left. I knew what was coming next, and sure enough, the next morning, an envelope marked "Final Enforcement Notice" sat in my mailbox. It said my property would be subject to lien if I failed to remove the unauthorized structure within 10 days. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I forwarded everything to my attorney and said, "Let's do it." Within 48 hours, the HOA board received a certified letter from my attorney's office. It outlined every violation of federal and state law they had committed: failure to provide reasonable accommodation, discrimination based on disability, and retaliation under the Fair Housing Act. The letter gave them a deadline to respond, warning that legal proceedings would begin immediately if they didn't comply. For the first time in months, I felt in control again. Not powerful, but grounded. They could manipulate perception, but not the law. Then the cracks began to show. 2 days after my attorney sent the letter, one board member, Linda, the treasurer, showed up at my door unannounced. She spoke softly, avoiding eye contact. She said the board wanted to revisit my request, that maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Her tone was almost pleading. I could tell she didn't want to be there. It was damage control. I thanked her for stopping by and told her all communication should go through my attorney now. The look on her face said it all. Panic. The next week, the board held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but I heard everything through whispers and community posts. Apparently, they were divided. Some members wanted to settle quietly. Others were furious that I'd gone legal. One neighbor messaged me privately saying the president was losing her composure during the meeting, insisting that we can't let him win or everyone will start demanding exceptions. That sentence burned into my mind. We can't let him win. I realized this wasn't about money or design standards. It was about control. The HOA board feared that acknowledging one person's rights meant losing authority over everyone else. But control has a price, and their arrogance was about to cost them everything. A few days later, my attorney forwarded me an email from their lawyer, a bland, carefully worded message saying the board was reviewing potential resolution terms. In legal language, that meant they were scared. But the damage they had done couldn't be undone with a single apology. Months of stress, humiliation, and retaliation had already carved deep scars into my life. Every time I rolled up that uneven driveway, I felt it. How my independence had become a battlefield. And then something strange happened. The same neighbors who once avoided me started quietly approaching again. One by one, they told me their own HOA horror stories. A family fined for hanging a flag, a retiree threatened for leaving a flower pot near the curb, a single mother charged late fees for dues she had already paid. The pattern was clear. The HOA had been abusing its power long before my ramp. My story had just exposed it. Word spread fast. Someone posted about my case anonymously in a local community forum. It went semi-viral. Comments poured in, people tagging disability rights groups and journalists. And then, one local reporter reached out. They wanted to cover my story. At first I hesitated. Public exposure meant attention, and attention could backfire. But after everything they'd done, I realized silence was exactly what the HOA wanted. So I agreed, on one condition. The story would focus on accessibility and accountability, not drama. When the article went live, everything shifted overnight. The headline read, "Disabled homeowner denied ramp by HOA, threatens legal action under disability laws." The photo showed my ramp in all its simple, functional reality. It wasn't ugly, it wasn't disruptive, it was a basic necessity. The backlash against the HOA was immediate. Hundreds of comments criticized the board's cruelty. Some neighbors began demanding the president's resignation. Sponsors of the community events quietly pulled funding. The same people who once whispered behind fences were now speaking out. For a brief moment, I felt vindicated. But the board wasn't finished. The HOA issued a public statement claiming my story was inaccurate and that I had refused reasonable alternatives. They said I was seeking attention. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, but the more they spoke, the more they exposed themselves. Emails leaked from within the board, messages showing they had deliberately ignored my requests for months and discussed ways to pressure compliance before any legal action. Someone from inside had turned against them. When my attorney showed me those leaked emails, I felt both fury and relief. They had done this to themselves. The board scheduled a special session to discuss their next move, but it was too late. The community had already seen who they truly were. Neighbors began showing up to meetings, demanding answers. Attendance tripled. The once untouchable president now looked cornered, sweating under fluorescent lights as residents questioned every decision. I watched from the back of the room as their empire of control started to crumble. But I also knew this wasn't over. Retaliation can take new forms when pride is wounded, and I could feel it, that quiet, simmering energy of revenge still flickering beneath the surface. When I got home that night, there was another envelope taped to my door. No name, no return address, just one printed sentence. "You should have kept quiet." My hands shook as I peeled the paper off the door. The ink smudged under my thumb. I looked around. Darkness, the faint glow of porch lights, the hum of distant sprinklers. The neighborhood looked calm on the outside, but inside, I knew something dangerous had shifted. The HOA was cornered, and desperate people do desperate things. I took the note inside, placed it next to my growing pile of evidence, and realized something chilling. The lawsuit wasn't just about to start, it was about to expose everything. And when it did, there would be no going back. The morning after finding that note on my door, I realized something important. Fear was exactly what they wanted me to feel, but I wasn't going to give them that power anymore. The HOA had crossed every line imaginable: discrimination, retaliation, intimidation, and now they were playing dirty. I decided it was time to finish what they started. My attorney filed the official complaint under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. It named the HOA, the board president, and the property management company as respondents. The paperwork was dense, pages of timelines, photos, emails, and statements, but every word told a simple story. I just wanted access to my own home, and they punished me for it. Once the lawsuit was filed, things moved fast. Within a week, the HOA was served. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The once calm cul-de-sac now buzzed with tension. Cars slowed when they passed my house. Neighbors whispered in driveways. Even the landscapers avoided eye contact. The story everyone had tried to keep quiet was now public record. Then came the cover-up. Almost overnight, the HOA board's tone flipped. The same president who had mocked my request was suddenly sending cheerful newsletters about our commitment to inclusivity and accessibility. They launched a community improvement initiative, claiming they'd always planned to review accessibility standards. They painted themselves as heroes, fixing a problem they created. It was shameless. They even tried to scrub old meeting minutes from the community website, minutes that showed how many times I had requested the ramp and how many times they denied it. But what they didn't know was that I had already saved every single file. I had timestamps, screenshots, and even backup copies stored offline. When my attorney saw their public rebranding, she smiled and said, "They're trying to rewrite history." That's good. It means they're scared. Scared was an understatement. Behind the scenes, the HOA's lawyer reached out with a settlement offer. They proposed to approve my ramp design and reimburse my fines if I agreed to drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The irony almost made me laugh. They had dragged me through months of humiliation and now wanted silence in exchange for crumbs. I turned it down. I didn't come this far to help them hide what they did to me, or to others. When the hearing date was announced, the pressure on the board skyrocketed. Community chatter grew louder. Residents began digging into their own experiences, fines that never made sense, fees that mysteriously increased, selective enforcement that always seemed to target the same few households. And then the breaking point came. A former board member, someone who had resigned 2 years earlier, reached out to me privately. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore. She had kept records, emails proving that the president and a few others had intentionally targeted homeowners they didn't like. My name was on that list. Next to it a note, "Keep property uniform, no exceptions, even disability ones." I remember staring at that screenshot for minutes, unable to move. It wasn't just discrimination. It was intent. That evidence changed everything. My attorney filed an amended complaint, adding intentional discrimination and emotional distress. The case shifted from a simple accommodation dispute to a full-blown civil rights violation. Once the Federal Housing Authority got involved, the HOA couldn't hide behind their community bylaws anymore. Suddenly, the same neighbors who once saw me as a nuisance started rallying behind me. A few offered to testify. Some started attending the board meetings just to watch the meltdown happen in real time. The room that used to echo with polite laughter now pulsed with confrontation. Residents demanded accountability. By the time the first mediation session happened, the board looked fractured. The treasurer had resigned. The secretary refused to speak. And the president, who once stood so proudly behind the rules, now looked cornered, sweating through her blazer under fluorescent lights. She tried to defend the board's actions as miscommunication. But the mediator, a calm man with decades of housing law experience, simply asked, "If this was miscommunication, why did you fine him weekly after receiving his doctor's letter?" The silence that followed was heavy. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the faint tapping of my attorney's pen. From that moment on, they knew the case was lost. Weeks later, my attorney received the settlement proposal that would finally end it all. The HOA agreed to a full accommodation, reimbursement of all fines, and a public written apology. They also agreed to pay damages and legal fees, enough to cover not just the ramp, but months of lost peace of mind. But what mattered most wasn't the money. It was the clause that came next. Under the settlement, the HOA was required to adopt a new accessibility policy for all homeowners, to attend mandatory disability awareness training, and to submit compliance reports for 2 years. Their power wasn't gone, but it was finally checked. When I rolled up to the meeting where the board formally announced the changes, the mood in the room felt different. Gone was the arrogance. Gone were the whispers. The board president read from a pre-written statement, voice trembling slightly. The HOA recognizes the importance of accessibility for all residents and apologizes for previous actions that may have caused distress or discrimination. It wasn't heartfelt, it wasn't personal, but it was public, and that was enough. After the meeting, neighbors approached me, not with pity but with respect. One older man said quietly, "You did what all of us were too scared to do." Another whispered, "They've been bullies for years." For the first time in months, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own neighborhood. I felt seen. But even as justice settled in, the emotional toll lingered. Every sound of rustling paper outside my door still made me flinch. Every email notification made my chest tighten. The scars of constant fear don't vanish when the rules change. They just fade slowly, one quiet day at a time. Still, There was something freeing about wheeling up that new ramp for the first time. Smooth, stable, perfectly measured to code, and built by the same community that once tried to deny it. I paused halfway up, feeling the late afternoon sun on my face, and thought, this is what victory looks like. Not revenge, not anger, just peace. That peace didn't come easily for everyone else. 2 months after the settlement, the HOA president resigned under pressure. The new board was elected, fresh faces, humbler voices, promises of transparency. The community slowly began to rebuild its trust. For the first time, board meetings were open, minutes were posted honestly, and homeowners actually smiled again. The story that had started with one ramp ended up transforming an entire neighborhood. Sometimes I think about that note they left on my door. You should have kept quiet. If I had, they would have kept doing this to others. They would have kept hiding behind fine print and false smiles. Silence would have been their shield. But I didn't stay quiet. I spoke up, and that made all the difference. Now, whenever I roll up my ramp, I look at the small brass plaque beside it, installed by the new board as part of the settlement's Accessibility Awareness Program. It reads simply, "Access is not a privilege, it's a right." That line says everything I fought for, because in the end, this story was never just about a ramp. It was about dignity. And no HOA, no matter how powerful, can take that away again.